Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, September 26th, 2023. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. This is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so please be nice to each other and follow the code of conduct. And yeah, we'll go ahead and hop straight into it today. Didn't really have much on the agenda, so we'll use most of this time for NPEP review unless folks have any other things to bring up. I only had one thing to highlight, which was on the dev side, our Netlify previews have been broken for a while, ever since I renamed our main branch, our master branch to main. I fixed that. I got that fixed yesterday. So if you want to render your website previews again, just go ahead and re-push your commits and it should update automatically. Apart from that, I don't think I really have anything else. So I am happy to hand it over for folks who want to talk about NPEPs. I don't care if we start with, I know Raul wanted to talk about FQDN, and I'm sure Nadia wants to talk about tenancy. Who wants to go first? I will pick then. How about we start with Raul then, because he was here first.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, all right, thanks. On the FQDN side of things, I pushed in update yesterday, which I hope addresses a few of the comments that I got. But there are two major discussion points that are happening in the comments that I figured we'd bring to the broader discussion and have people hash out here maybe. The two are whether we want to have deny rules and whether we want to, or how we want to handle DNS records with short TTLs or DNS records whose IPs change very rapidly. I think those are the two major ones. Nadia and Dan, you guys were in the comments, so if there's anything else you want to talk about, I guess shout that out as well. I guess we can start with the deny rules. This is something that we've talked about a decent amount in the past, and I know Dan's had a great write-up that hopefully people have had a chance to read. Basically, the long and short of it is that writing deny rules based on DNS entries can get complicated because IP DNS is an incomplete spec in the sense of you're not guaranteed to get every single IP back in your domain for any given request, and so you have a hard time guaranteeing that when you're trying to enforce a deny rule, you're actually denying every single possible IP a client could be reaching. That's hopefully I did that justice. That's sort of the Cliff Notes version of the security concern with deny rules. And the thing I'm struggling with is I haven't come up with any good user stories for deny rules. And that's why I'm leaning towards not having no deny FQDN. But I want to open that up to other folks and help me fill in the blanks of things I've missed, especially Yang, because I know Antria has deny FQDN rules, or at least I think it does. So I'm curious if you have any good user stories that maybe we could think about.
Well, let me chip in on that. I think to me, I don't think we implemented deny rule because of there's any sort of like outstanding use cases for it. But I guess for the sake of consistency of the API, right? Because we put it in the same sort of like custom resource as the other sort of like in cluster rules of Antria policies, and that's why we wanted to have the same sort of like look and feel when user apply these policies. And I think I have read Dan's comment on the NPEP. I have yet to respond. But I think my question would be yes, I understand there's a problem where two different FQDNs could result to the same IP. So if this is a L4 based solution, then it might be that two different rules created, two different priorities have sort of like conflicting actions, which causes the problem. My question for this is that it doesn't really matter if we implement deny for FQDN or not. As long as this is like a L4 based enforcement, we will have this problem because say if we only implement allow rules, right? And the allow rules only make sense if there's some sort of like deny all rules lying under, which says I wanted to deny every egress traffic other than the FQDNs I'm allowed, right? So if that allowed rule, that FQDN resolves to an address which can be associated with a bunch of different FQDNs, then essentially your allow rule doesn't only allow what's written in the FQDN policy, but allow maybe potentially a couple of other domains as well, right? So that's why the deny rule underneath, however that is implemented, doesn't sort of like have the default be or expected behavior that the users are thinking them to act like. But that's a problem that I don't think we can solve as long as the policy only operates at the L4 level. I'm not sure if I'm making sense here.
Yeah, that does make sense. And that is a good point. It's not on the part that Andrew has on the screen right now, but I think I brought up later. The real problem with deny rules for me is that this is still the same one. It seems like, like you said, oh, well, the API already supports it and it's easy to implement in the same way. And so you can do that, but it creates traps for the user where you say, I want to deny everything to google.com, but then like, what if they figure out the IP via some means other than the DNS resolver that we're snooping? And then, they can sneak around the deny rule. So it's more just that it's easy for users to misuse, and maybe that's just a documentation issue. But given that we also had no explicit use cases for it, maybe we want to leave it out.
Yeah, I agree with that too. It's just that, we also wanted to make sure that without explicit deny rules, we don't go with the quote unquote implicit isolation behavior like a network policy, right? So we definitely wanted something at least like you should create a rule underneath so that every egress traffic is blocked other than the FQDN rules, or we come up with some other sort of like API designs to sort of like explicitly signal that, rather than something like network policy where when you select a bunch of pods and you impose an FQDN rule on it, then it becomes implicit isolated for every egress traffic. I think that's the one thing that I don't want to see for the FQDN rules. But other than that, I think I'm fine with not implementing deny rules for FQDN if there's no better use case for it.
Awesome. Thanks for the context, Ian. Does anyone else want to chime in on like use cases or thoughts about denying? I mean, from what I'm hearing, I'm going to propose that we stick only to allow for now. And yeah, we'll probably want to include a best practices section that says if you're using FQDN allow rules, or really any type of allow rules, you probably want a catch-all deny at the bottom of it. Otherwise, these policies may not do anything. Definitely, we should have some more.
Documentation is going to be important there. I'm trying to think, because I think that's a broad statement, right? Like it's not going to always be the case that if you don't have an underlying deny-all, like we designed ANP explicitly to not have to be always a whitelist type policy set, right? But we made it expressive enough so that it could be with baseline, kind of, because there's holes there with network policy, right? So it's a little bit more subtle, and I think that leads to a lot of confusion. So I know I know Yang's writing something that should help, but documentation is going to be really key. I don't have any feelings for or against this. I think not doing deny for the first pass is fine. I think the cool part about the cycle we have now is like if we implement allow on DNS and then we ship it as an experimental feature or even an implementation specific feature, and we get a bunch of people saying, oh, we want denies, like we can reevaluate that in the future with another NPEP. So like, let's, keep moving forward and see what the users want at the end of the day. Sorry, Nadia, I saw you had your hand raised.
I wanted to say a similar thing, like one of the use cases when you don't really need to have an explicit deny after FQDN rule is if you just want to make sure like namespace network policy do not deny something you want to always allow, right? So you can't just say I want to allow that FQDN and then have 0 denies in the end, because there are network policies, there is BNP lower level. So that can be like an example use case.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
have a follow-up question on that though. Like, are we thinking of? I know this is very API detail, but are we still thinking of having FQDN rules in the admin network policy objects itself? Because right now I know that on the website we say that admin network policy doesn't at all touches north-south traffic. So I'm not too sure how when FQDN comes in, how that changes things, because now you will have to say something like for egress rules, a drop all rule would affect north-south as well, right? But otherwise, the FQDN allow doesn't make any sense then.
Well, that behavior is changing with Surya's egress cap, right? So like for now, if this goes in,
okay.
I would assume this is going in after the egress, and it will only apply to egress, right?
Okay.
Well, we're gonna have to think about that on Surya's NPEP, like in the API design when we're writing the API about how if default behavior changes, which I'm hoping it doesn't, but I'm gonna have to think about that more.
Okay, I need to look at that NPEP a little bit more, but thanks for the pointer.
Yeah, it merged. So that NPEP merged last week. So we're in the process
Cool.
of now Surya's opened some PRs for actually getting the API implementation going. So we can hash it out in there.
Okay, cool.
I was just going to add to the support of not implementing it, like with our clients, the ones that do enforce like egress based deny are doing a blanket like cover and then punching holes to specific egress endpoints, usually through like an Istio egress rule, but similar sort of functionality. Like they're going to say which endpoints they want specifically and then just deny the rest. I think that's pretty common. The reverse of that, yeah, may not be necessary.
Sweet.
Awesome.
Yeah, that seems like a common practice, especially for admins. So at least we provide a bunch of different layers of being able to do that, right? Like you can provide it, like Nadia was saying, you can say like, you could make a hard deny everything and poke holes, or you could make a soft deny at baseline and allow network policy admins, namespace admins to override those rules with network policies. So should just fit in there.
Awesome. And the other topic I wanted to discuss was, I'm kind of conflating the two, but the idea that either a domain would have rapidly changing IPs, or that the domain would return records with extremely short TTLs. Potentially even 0, but sub-minute, sub-second, or individual seconds, and whether or how we want to handle that from an API perspective. I think the major concern was that, and Nadia, correct me if I'm wrong, but and Dan too, but that if we make a claim about how responsive the system is, are we shutting out certain implementations? Are we restricting users to only implement it one way and not another? I personally am not too concerned about that, so long as what restrictions we're setting make sense from a user perspective. But I'm open to hearing counter thoughts to that. My thought is, if we all think that picking a random, a 1 minute TTL is more than reasonable, and you don't need to respond faster than that, but you have to respond to 1 minute TTLs, then it's okay for implementations to have to bend to move forward. Anyone have any thoughts on whether we want to enforce something at the API level?
So generally agree with what you said. I mean, one thing, it sounds like we probably do want to include wildcard support, and that certainly imposes requirements, on the implementation, right? Because you can't do it the proactively resolving IP addresses way when you have wildcards. So I think we already are going down that path of making certain implementation requirements on implementations. So we don't need to be shying away from that if we think it's the best plan. I guess. Well, and I think maybe also we're going to want to have like implementation suggestions, like like stuff like that chart and the comments that I pulled out from the Google and OpenShift docs saying, look, like here's what people have done before, and we have found that certain things don't work well. So if you're implementing this, you should think twice before doing it, in certain ways. I guess I would be okay if we had only weak guarantees for the end user that, certain things would be supported. And I guess if we make weak promises initially and decide that we need stronger promises later, we could do that.
That kind of should come with our new release channel / support level work, right? Like if we feel like there's parts of this feature that don't necessarily,
well, no,
this
isn't about parts of the feature. This is about, is it legitimate if, say, OpenShift ships a version of this where it detects, any changes automatically, no matter how fast they are, and Antria ships a version that only detects changes every 5 seconds. Like, is that a legitimate outcome?
That'll have to be tested in our conformance, in our conformance testing.
Well, so I guess that would just be a conformance thing then, that we would say, you're required to catch changes at least this often, but not necessarily any faster.
Right.
Yeah, I think we could make a timer based on extended core, something like that, like levels of support or something, if needed, to say a default value and then compare it or something.
Yeah, I mean, it just means that like this field, a wildcard selector as a field or as a feature we'd provide extended support, meaning our conformance test to some spec that some implementations may not be able to support, and that's fine, right?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't just be wildcard. I think even specifying a single domain, I think the use case is if it's behind a cloud load balancer that, just decides IPs change every second, everyone get with the program, then yeah, even a single domain has to deal with this.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fair enough. I think, yeah.
Nadia's had her hand up for a while.
So did I get that we actually do want to make all these things optional and not predefined in our API?
I don't think so. I think we were mostly just talking about the like, well, the conversation sort of moved, but I think we were originally talking about guarantees on how responsive it is to rapidly changing IP addresses, and what we want to require for conformance there.
Yeah, I had a point like around that, but it's also maybe easier to use these wildcards as an example, but it's also like a part of implementation, let's say. So the problem with strictly defined requirements is that if I have a network plugin, right, and I can do non-wildcard FQDN rules. And if we say that wildcards are absolutely required, then I cannot really use that API. But also I don't have any other way to define any policies in the same priority range. Let's say I cannot implement like another completely different API that would be somewhere between A and P priorities, maybe, because that may be extremely difficult. So that's why it may be important to allow for such cases, so that plugins actually, I mean, that may lead to not being able to use ANPs in general. With that, if I need just one FQDN only rule and I cannot use this API because it requires wildcards, then I cannot really use anything after that, if that makes sense.
So you're saying split this feature up essentially into individually toggleable optional features. Like one is just FQDN, one is just wildcard.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't know what is actually a good way to implement that now. I'm mostly on a use case level.
I mean, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. It might be more complicated than it needs to be, but I don't know. I'll let maybe Andrew, someone who understands the optional thing, talk more about that.
I think for this stage of the NPEP, that's not as important, right? Like we can figure out how the API looks in the next stage. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that actually, that applies to this rapidly changing APs, right? As I think we've discussed, like we can't just predefine very wide limitations, let's say, that let's say like within 5 minutes, you should be able to reflect the change in the IP, right? But then like what is frequently changing IPs, like how often that actually is. And also different plugins may have different limitations on that. So we don't want someone slow enough, let's say, but if my slow API still like serves some of my customers, I probably still want to use this API for that.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something we can figure out right here regardless. Like that, this seems like if we're going to constrain anything, it's going to be done and reported via conformance tests. So probably something we need in a conformance testing section or in like the actual PR that adds conformance tests. I don't know if we can define that here, but sorry, go ahead, Dan.
So this might be something to discuss more at another time, but I feel like we're leaning too much on the idea of optional features. Like in Gateway, they absolutely need that because you have people building Gateway implementations on top of, GCP's load balancers or on top of Nginx or, on top of whatever. And they don't have the ability to add features like regex, HTTP path matching to the underlying software that they're using. So some of these Gateway features have to be optional. But that's not really the case for us. Like people are going to be writing their admin network policy implementations from scratch. And yes, some people might have existing networking policy features that don't do everything that we do, but they could still write the features that we have. We can say you need to implement all of these features to be a conformant ANP implementation. And again, maybe this is a conversation for later, but I think saying that wildcards are an optional feature is a bad idea. Like either it should be a feature that all users can rely on in all clusters, or it should not be part of the feature at all.
I agree. The design constraints are different. I think us as a community will kind of develop like what we think around that, right? I tend to agree with you, right? Like if we're as an upstream community saying ANP should work with FQDN names, like it definitely shouldn't be implementation specific. Like if you are implementing ANP, the API, for you to be fully conformant, you better support FQDN names. But I think we're kind of in the weeds of like, do you support FQDN names and does it pick up, records with really low TTL timelines? Like we're kind of in the weeds, and I don't know if we need to be right now is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, that
At
sounds
this
good.
stage anyway.
Yeah, if we're okay with it, I'll maybe make a note of what we've discussed so far and like leave it a little bit open for the time being. We can revisit it once we write some more tests and hash out the API if everyone's okay with that.
Works for me.
Awesome. That's all I had on the FQDN side.
Cool. Okay. I think that is a good point, Dan. I'm gonna think more on that one. I don't think we should definitely exactly mimic Gateway API and everything. But there definitely seems to be some relationship between, you know, different cloud load balancers and different CNIs, right? It's just about where we as a community want to draw the line. And that's going to be done via conformance testing, really, for the most part. And conformance profiles. Okay, cool. Next one up, Nadia, do you want to bring up your NPEP or do you want me to bring it up?
Yeah, it would be nice if you could do that, but I've actually replied to most of the comments. There are just some recent ones that are not done yet. So one of them is the discussion around a use case I wrote to create the so-called non-tenant, which differs from the existing API that we have. So now it is not possible to have this kind of thing. And I actually wrote down that user story because it is kind of an existing user stories and the user story, and I figured it's not just covered by default right now. So that's why I actually wrote it down. Because for now, if you want, like, if tenancy rules are strict enough, and let's say they are supposed to deal with security concerns, then currently it relies on admin or whoever owns namespace labels to label every namespace probably before any pods are created in there, because otherwise it will not be a part of tenancy. And if I want this tenancy, let's say, like if I want to deny any connections between different tenants, I want every single pod in the cluster to be a part of some tenant. So that actually brings it down to me as cluster admin making sure I absolutely always have the right labels on all namespaces. And that's just not really secure. So I mean, I could create a tenant with, by default, if the tenant doesn't have any, if a namespace doesn't have tenancy labels, I may want to put it in a separate non-tenant that I just, let's say, deny to talk to anyone before I actually define to which tenant it should belong with the specific label. So that's actually kind of about security. And I see we have some comments about that. So yeah, and I see Rahul wants to say something. So let's do that.
No, didn't mean to cut you off whenever you're done.
Okay. Yeah, then, well, does anyone has any comments or questions about that? Or do you think we should, like, if that user story makes sense, or if we should change it somehow?
My only thought was that at that point, it feels like what we really want to write is a default deny, right? Like, it seems like what you're describing isn't too unique to tenancy, right? Like, I could do this by saying default deny, and then if you belong to a tenant, you're allowed to talk within the tenant. And I think that would capture the intent. Is that correct?
Well, maybe some use cases can actually be solved like that, but that literally says that if you have this use case, you cannot do that with just the tenancy, and that doesn't really implement that fact that I want tenants to not be able to talk to each other because there are namespaces that are not a part of any tenant. So tenancy doesn't apply to them at all. So basically what actually protects me is the default deny rule, which I may or may not want to have actually. So it's, I mean, for the simple use case, I guess there are ways, yeah, to implement that with like extra objects. That makes sense, but that's not exactly.
Well, I mean, I guess I don't want an implicit tenant. I guess I'm okay with someone saying if the namespace has no such label, then put it all in a bucket and deny traffic there. Like as long as they explicitly have to write a rule to that effect, I don't mind so much. I'm just saying that at that point, that's not specific to the tenant API itself, right? Like that's just saying if this label does not exist on this namespace, the pods just cannot talk to anyone. It's kind of like a default deny.
Yeah, I think I
Well-
plus one Rahul on this one. Like when I think of a tenant, right? Like you're either creating hard or soft tenant boundaries, which you covered in earlier user stories. But kind of a general rule is, right, if you're a tenant, you want to be able to set up walls between everything else. Like a tenant knows of itself that you can either allow it to talk to other tenants, or you can allow it to talk to maybe even other resources in the cluster. But at the end of the day, you should be able to easily express with a default deny, like I am a tenant, don't let me talk to anything else, right? So in saying that, I think a default deny would make sense in this case, rather than having like some explicit none tenant.
Right. I think my problem with that is think of a really obvious example, right? Kube system. Does that belong to a tenant? I don't think so, right? Obviously not. Now, what sort of like default group do you want to put it in? Like if we don't label a Kube system with some tenant label, does that get sort of like isolated by default with the others? And that's really a bad idea, right? Because that's why that's how all the tenants would not maybe talk to DNS, for example, right? So in my opinion, what the tenant label or the tenancy API should do is that it defines a set of label, and for the namespaces which has this label, we consider them as a tenant, and then all the requirements we have on tenants, which is written in the rules, applies to them. But for the namespaces that doesn't have these labels, in most cases they don't really actually belong to a tenant, and those would be sort of like the traffic that isn't sort of like captured by this policy, and maybe other policies in the cluster, admin level policies, based on admin level policies, or even Kubernetes level policies, will touch base on those kind of like traffic and say if those are allowed or denied. But it's not the tenancy policy concern per se, right? That's my take on this, and it's sort of like always my take on this though. But
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I guess the only difference is that for like this user story or use case is that if you can implement this with just the tenancy, or if you need to define a tenancy in a different way and create some extra ANP or some other rule that will actually do the security that you want here, that is explained in this story.
Maybe this comes. Sorry.
No, please go on.
Maybe this comes back to another discussion we were having, which, in my mind, tenancy makes sense as part of ANP, not a separate parallel universe. I was thinking of tenancy being a type of selector, or, maybe a more sophisticated one, but it's still part of the same priority rule, in which case I think it's more natural for users to expect that behavior, where they're sort of, like Yang said, they pick a label that defines tenancy and things can go into tenants. And then there's other pods that don't have that label and they, I think, naturally would fall into writing ANP rules for that.
Yeah.
I'm plus on our rule. Like, I think a lot of people here are thinking about tenancy at this point as a feature of AMP rather than its own whole separate brand new sparkly API. And I know we were trying to kick that can down the road. So it's a little bit tricky, but again,
it is tricky. It is tricky because I totally see Nadia's point here, because in AMPs, when you do a subject, you either do a namespace selector or a pod selector, and you have a really defined set of pods that you're applying this policy to. But for tenancy, if we don't design this correctly, you can potentially apply the policy to the entire cluster. But by the end of the day, you know, the pods that are the namespace that are affected are actually those who has those labels. And this is a fact that's kind of like implicit in the current API. We haven't sort of like explained it really clearly, so that's why it confuses people, right? So I do believe that is a valid point. I just don't think that it makes sense to me to do something like, because we have this problem, now we wanted to extend the tenancy to the namespace that actually don't have this label. I don't sort of want that. We wanted to fix the original problem, but I don't want it to sort of like extend this to do something else to the other namespaces. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I didn't really mean separate APIs necessarily when I said that. I just mean like you either need to only talk about tenancy or like whatever rule you define, even if it's a part of ANP, right? You think, what are my tenants? And then you either have the whole cluster covered, or you need to remember that you literally need to label something to become a part of that and to be selected for tenancy. And then I guess the main concern here is that I probably do want to label every namespace that I intend to be a part of a tenant at some point, but to ensure like the proper security level, I need to I need to label that before I create any pods, as I said, like to just make sure they don't have this period of time before I actually decided which tenant I want this namespace to belong to. So that's basically the main concern.
well, maybe I'm wrong, but in most like real world production deployments, right, you have a cluster admin that's spawning new namespaces or projects for you, right? Aren't they in full control of, you know, I've created a namespace with labels X, Y, and Z, in the fact that I'm creating a new tenant or I'm adding this namespace to an existing tenant? I guess it's kind of a use question.
Whenever we build an engineering platform, we grant teams the ability to create their own teams, which creates namespaces, but we enforce certain labels when we do that in any scaled model.
I mean, that's just an extra level of what you need to make sure exists. Like you need to be sure to label all the tenants just to enforce the correct tenancy, right? And I want
Yes,
to do that without
that's true.
without
true,
any
Nadia. That's
extra
true, Nadia.
actions.
Yes, that's true, Nadia. But you know, to be honest with you, I don't think this is a problem with tenant itself, right? Think of the admin policy we have right now. Like if I wanted to do we don't do explicit tenancy definitions. We just do a specific tenancy scenario where we say engineering cannot talk to accounting, for example, right? So the AMP will look like, let's select all the engineering namespaces, which is label equals app equals engineering, and then we deny traffic to label app equals marketing, something like that, right? So if the admin do spawn up a network policy that doesn't have label app equals engineering, that new namespace fail because it doesn't belong to the subject of the admin network policy. So the problem described does exist, and I agree it's a valid problem. But as long as admin network policy is a label selector based approach for enforcing security, we can't really get around that, right? Because it exists now. It's not specific to tenancy. So to ensure that the policy behaves as what it states, I do think there's some sort of like responsibilities on the users to ensure that the namespaces that created are correctly labeled so that they belong to a policy where they wish the namespace to be subject of. That's I don't know if
Yeah, that all makes sense.
yeah, right.
Yeah, well, and actually, I mean, there are, as we've discussed, there are basically many ways to kind of implement the same use case with just different extra actions, right? So I guess the only improvement that would give us is just to have this one less condition, one less action to do on top of these to just ensure that. And well, I mean, that is not absolutely necessary, just like if we want to allow these or not, actually. So yeah, so I don't know if I like want to what is the correct like outcome to write down. Maybe we can continue that discussion in this common thread, and then I can either leave it or remove this user story completely. Maybe.
Yeah, let's do it. But I do have one quick question for you, Nadia. Is that in the default tenant story that you're creating, right? So what you envision is let me know if that makes sense, right? If you have an AMP which applies to all the entire cluster, and you say I define the tenant as you have a team label, right? It's team accounting, team marketing, or whatever. It's on the team label. So what you're saying that is for the namespaces that doesn't have the team label, they're sort of like auto categorized into one, default tenant sort of thing, right? And let's say the AMP has a rule that, I wanted to just deny ingress from any other tenant. What that means is that if this policy applies to the entire cluster, then no tenant will talk to DNS by default, right? Is that a fair assessment of this? Because kube system will belong to the default tenant, which is not part of any other tenants. So if any of the tenants want to initiate a connection to kube system, let's say we deny all egress to other tenants, right? So that will fail, right? Because they are on different tenant boundaries.
Yeah, and so I guess there are multiple ways on how you may want to configure this, right? So first of all, like how you may want to only define the tenancy for, let's say, user created tenants, which you can identify in any way, or you can just list the names, the system namespaces like DNS or something else like Kube API if you want just to not be a part of this tenancy at all, right? So basically everything else will be a part of the tenant. And then another thing is your tenancy may probably be something like trusted and untrusted tenant, and then the trusted one will be actually the one that may talk to all of the kube resources, right? So you label everything that you want to talk to them, and then you create a new one, and you want to make sure that only the allowed one, the trusted namespaces, can talk to DNS and Kube API and I don't know what. Right, and before you labeled it, it actually has access to everything. So you need to go and make sure you apply the right tenant label to that in that case, if that makes sense. So there are multiple intentions that you actually may have, I guess, as a cluster admin for that example.
Okay, yeah, I need to think a little bit more on that, but let's definitely continue discussion on the NAMPad.
Okay. I left a note that just said like lazy consensus is creating like an implicit non-tenancy is not the best. So I feel like the room's kind of leaning towards getting rid of that user story, but just know that continue that, and if it needs to change it. But let's try to like have it nailed down by next meeting, meaning like let's either move forward with it with this user story specifically because it seems like the main discussion point, or not. Sound good? I'm gonna take
Yes,
that
sounds
as a
good to me.
yes. Cool. Great work with this, Nadia. This has been a really complex NPEP, and I appreciate you sticking with it because, and for everyone for taking a look. It's been a good group effort here. Super awesome.
Yeah, thanks everyone for reviewing that. I know that's not the simplest NPEP to talk about. And also, if you want to discuss that in a more interactive way, we can try to do that in Slack or something like that if you don't see me or anyone else to be responsive enough. Even though I'm
Cool.
trying
Yeah,
to
that
reply
sounds
as soon
good.
as I
Like
can.
the GitHub Commons system is a mess.
It's not built for these long-winded review cycles that we end up with in enhancement proposals. Like it just falls apart completely. So
Yeah, or maybe
there
we
are
can
some.
make some kind of a rule if the discussion is longer than 10 comments in the same thread, we just start a new one in Slack. Maybe we can try that.
Yeah, I like that idea. Like whatever you think works, as long as we kind of stick to it. I think if there is room for like quick iteration in Slack, it's way better. And then in the conversation in GitHub, you can literally copy and paste the Slack discussion link and say like, go look here. I mean, it might time out in like a couple of years from now, but yeah. Cool. Sweet. Sounds like both these NPEPs are moving along. As I said before, kind of in line with NPEP work, the egress support NPEP merged last week. So huge kudos to Surya. She's not on the call for pushing that through. And she's opened up some drafts for actually looking at support. So we have some next steps coming down the pipe, which is really awesome. Looking forward to seeing those. So let's keep on pushing. I think tenancy is kind of the next in line to get merged. So let's try to keep focusing on that. I'd love, like I said, to have the user stories kind of agreed on by next session and then move forward from there. FQDN, hopefully shortly thereafter. Because otherwise, I think if we don't set like lines on ourselves, we can go around in circles very easily for a long time. I'm not saying we're doing that with tenancy yet, but we could end up there. Seems like we've narrowed down the discussion to one user story, so that's awesome. Cool. And yeah, so for folks who haven't been here the past couple of weeks, Hunter has actually been working on some Cyclonus stuff, which is awesome. He's been deep diving into it, and I saw he left a note that he's not here this morning for doctor stuff, but he's been working on Cyclonus, looking at what we need to do to add ANP support and seeing how we can kind of break it up into usable bits for us. So some exciting stuff coming from there. If you're interested in kind of the tooling and observability and conformance testing side of things, stay tuned to any issues or PRC opens, as it'll be really relevant. Cool. Okay, that's all I got. Is anything else? We got 7 minutes left that folks can take up.
Can
Going
I quickly
once.
reply to the question Brian actually had in the chat? I didn't have
Yeah, sure.
time to read
Please,
that. Yeah, that's
please do. Yeah.
a nice example of different teams, let's say, like finance team and that checkout team services. And if they want to actually grant access or like allow connections between each other, I guess that would be a case for admin, maybe, if they actually own different things. But like from if there is some tendency defined to just set different teams up and like allow or deny communication between them, that definitely would need to happen on an admin level. But then if just, let's say, one namespace denies everything by default, but then it decides that it wants to allow access from some other namespace, that probably will just be a network policy if there is nothing else in the cluster that actually restricts that, right? Because if there is something defined by admin, then probably admin had their reasons to do that. So then you need to go and talk to them. And then if it's like just the namespace policy, then probably it will stay namespaced.
Right. I guess what more wondering is like, is the tenancy API itself meant to be used by teams operating within the platform or by the admin?
Yeah, that's as a part of
By the
And-
admin. It's part of admin network policy. It's for the admin.
makes
There
sense.
there are two different user stories. One for I want to create tenants where the tenants can't ever talk to each other, and one for I want to create tenants where the tenants don't talk by default, but they can choose to. And that might be part of what you were asking as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, there's some really good analogies in the user stories there that help me kind of understand it. That's what I was thinking. So should be covered, but admins for the win here. Maybe in developer network policy, we'll come up with some crazy developer oriented tenancy.
There you go.
But-
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? Okay. On that note, we'll end a productive meeting. Thanks for coming by, everyone. I really appreciate it. And let's keep pushing forward. We'll see you next time.